And again, as I pull up this PowerPoint, feel free to share your video. This will be we hope, an engaging discussion on the film Public Trust. Not necessary to have watched it, since we'll be touching on some of the topics covered in the film today. Can you all see my screen? Okay, looks like you can. All right, whenever you're ready.
All right, yeah, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for Nancy and Patty for joining us for this discussion. So we're gonna talk really quick about a brief and true history of the National Park Service. A lot of us are not aware of the creation of National Park Service. Next slide, please. It was deemed as the America's best idea, but we actually don't know. A lot of us don't know that national parks were originally belongs to a lot of Native American. So including Glacier, Badlands, Mesa Verde, the Grand Canyon, and the Death Valley. There were many broken promises and unmet treaties while they were trying to preserve these wilderness. One of the example is the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. They failed to prevent white settlers to the land, and all the tribes lost hunting rights on the land. There was another example of the Nez Perce Wall in 1877. The tribes refused to give up their ancestral land in the Pacific Northwest, but it was actually a violation of the 1855 Treaty of Walla Walla. They were supposed to grant it 7.5 million acres of land, along with hunting rights and hunting and fishing rights in those land. Next slide, please. So while they were trying to preserve the wilderness, they wanted to remove all the native people from the land. So bison were killed to starve the natives into submission. There were lots of murder of native tribes and disposition of their lands. And the idea of manifest destiny led to complete shift of the cultural paradigm of the wilderness. So one of the article we read from the Atlantic that quoted that said, viewed from the perspective of history, Yellowstone is a crime scene. Next slide, please. So Yellowstone National Park was the first national park that was created in 1872 by the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. As you can see in this quote here, anything shall be considered trespassor and removed therefrom. So they wanted to preserve wilderness that is only including animals, fish, and trees, but it should be uninhabitable wilderness. And within Yellowstone area, there were originally 26 indigenous tribes in the area. And even right now, starting in 1894, they prohibited all hunting within the park boundaries. And even as recent as 2016, there were still legal fights over the hunting rights in that area. And next slide, please. And Araceli, you can hand it to Araceli.
Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about past US presidencies and how they help shape public lands. There are also public national monuments. So unlike national parks, which are created through Congress, national monuments are designated by US presidents under the Antiquities Act, which gives them the power to set aside public land for conservation. Former US President Theodore Roosevelt signed the act into law in 1906 and used it to protect Muir Woods and the Grand Canyon, which is now a national park, along with 16 other areas. So if you take a look at these two figures, you can see how much land was designated by acreage, and some of the presidents that designated the most were Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And on this figure, you can see how many monuments were designated by US presidents, just based on number. And Theodore Roosevelt, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama again designated most monuments by number. And then in contrast, the previous presidency is the only in US history to have removed more public lands and protected. Last year in 2020, the Center for American Progress calculated that the Trump administration attempted to remove protections from nearly 35 million acres of public lands. So near approximately 1,000 times more land than his administration protected. And then that 34.8 million acres is about the size of Florida. So you can see that's a pretty large amount of land. The Great American Outdoors Act was signed into law in August 2020 to fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund to restore national parks. However, the Trump administration missed submission deadlines, removed projects, and cut funds, and vetoed power that was given to local officials. And then this administration, Biden's administration, has been working to undo some of these roadblocks that the previous administration created. I don't know if there's anything else I might have missed on that, Ivy.
So when this film came out, Public Trust came out, there was a great large campaign to get the Great American Outdoors Act to sign into law. So now it has been signed, which is a great success. But at first it was kind of a difficult struggles. I think we're going to the right direction now. So next slide, please. With President Biden, one of the first things he did within his 100 days goal, he added the 30 by 30 initiative to preserve at least 30% of US land and ocean by 2030 as part of the global effort. A lot of other countries are doing this as well. And he nominated the first tribal member, Deb Haaland, to be the secretary for the Department of the Interior. He also stopped the border wall construction through the Big Bend National Park, which really damaged a lot of the wildlife and biodiversity during the construction. He also paused the oil and gas leasing activities in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is still being negotiated. And currently they're reviewing and considering to restore the boundaries of the barriers and the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments that are being discussed in this film. So I will hand it over to Cassandra so we can start our discussion. If anyone have any question, feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat.
Thank you both, Araceli and Ivy. So I'd like to begin this discussion with Nancy and Patty by asking, how are public lands defined in the US and who has access to these lands?
I can start, unless Patty, you're welcome to start if you prefer. I think one thing that's important for people to understand that wasn't entirely clear from the film is that national parks and monuments and marine monuments are a subset of the public lands. The public lands owned by the United States is a much larger span of territory than the national parks. And that has significant implications for how the public land can be used under our laws. Public lands in general enjoy much less protections from development and different kinds of uses than the national parks do. And if you look at the country historically, well, where do these lands come from? Well, after we fought a revolutionary war, Britain ceded all the land that it owned to what was then the United States government, which was then the Articles of Confederation, and subsequently to the United States under the Constitution. And the United States continued to expand and take territories by war, both from Native Americans and from other countries like Spain, from which we took Texas and California and other territories, and the Louisiana Purchase. So when you say the Louisiana Purchase, who purchased what? The United States government purchased vast territories of land. And when we talk about that, we hear that as a bad land that had nothing on it at the time, no people and nothing happening on it at the time. The United States just took ownership of big swaths of land. And the reality, and I'm going to defer to Patty to speak about this part, is that there were native populations on this land across the continent at all times. So when we talk about protections of public lands, it's really important to understand that the land we're talking about protecting often was land that was simply taken from other people. And we've put restrictions and permissions on uses that affect different people in different ways. Sort of around the mid 19th century, we moved from acquiring public lands to trying to develop the lands and seeding them through things like homestead acts to people, usually white people, to develop and use for their own purposes. And then if they stayed on it for 5 years and cultivated it, they could get ownership. And this continued as we moved out west to encourage mining and railroads. Again, always stepping hard on Native peoples and their traditional uses of lands along the way. Towards the second half of the 20th century, we actually flipped a little bit back to become more protective of these lands. We stopped the Homestead Acts and ceding of rights, and we developed environmental laws for protections. I think my main point is that, it hasn't been a strictly smooth path. We have always stepped on people and their rights along the way. And what we can do on what we call different kinds of public lands really varies depending on how they're classified. And with that lengthy explanation, I'm going to turn it over to Patty.
That was such a good explanation, Nancy. I would take one step back and talk about the Doctrine of Discovery in 1493, which is the papal declaration that any land that a European nation found to be unoccupied by Christians could be claimed for that foreign power. So this is why you see Spain planting its flag in what became Florida and the California. This is why the English claimed lands in along the eastern seaboard. Why the French became interested in trade in the Upper Great Lakes region. And when we think about this doctrine, I think a lot of people assume that it's something, in the distant past. Well, it's not something we would ever do these days. However, as recently as 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited the Doctrine of Discovery in a legal case denying the Oneida land claims in a case called Sherrill versus New York, Sherrill, the town of Sherrill versus New York. So, and the Doctrine of Discovery basically said that not only could these European nations plant their flag and claim this land as their own, but that the native people inside that land didn't own anything. They just had the right of occupancy, like deer or rabbits or bison. And so this is the process by which Native people became disenfranchised from the land that we never really thought about in terms of ownership, but rather in terms of use. So I'll just add that to Nancy's.
And if I could just add one thing, being the law professor on this, following up on one thing that Patty said about Justice Ginsburg's decision. I think when you look at the history in the United States, it's important to recognize that the United States courts, and especially the Supreme Court, played a pretty significant role in promoting the doctrines that Patty was just describing, and saying that it was fine for white settlers and white Americans to abridge, abrogate treaty obligations that they had made and take away rights that they had acknowledged long ago in treaties. And so our court system has played a really key role in a lot of the harms that have been done as we've claimed public lands and what people can and can't do on them, most often upholding deprivations of native traditional rights on traditionally native lands.
And if I can add a footnote, there's a lot about Justice Bader Ginsburg that I love. I mean, I think she's done, it takes nothing away from what, you know, I think she's done for women and children in this country and my overall admiration of her. But on this one particular ruling, yeah, not my favorite.
So following up with that, then the way in which ownership is conceptualized by the states is by purchase, physical money, and a transaction happening. That's who actually owns the land, correct?
Yes, except that under our Homestead Acts, going back into the 1800s, you didn't actually have to pay money. You could just occupy land, occupy 160 acres, live on it and cultivate it for 5 continuous years and take ownership of it, have ownership rights in it. One thing that's also worth noting from a legal perspective is that somewhere in the 1800s, we separated the notion of surface rights. I mean, in legal English tradition, this had always existed, but with respect to homesteading and things like that, there are mineral rights underneath the surface, which can be transferred separately from surface use rights and ownership. And at some point, we separated, even for homesteading, the homesteaders would get surface rights, but not the mineral rights underneath.
Yeah, and I would just, pulling that forward, you see that Native communities have really become sacrifice zones on these, you know, erstwhile public lands. You know, we have 500 abandoned uranium mines in Navajo country. We have, you know, and Nancy, the separation that you described of surface and subsurface rights really plays into what's happened with the Hopi and the Navajo, where the Hopi were forced to share subsurface rights with the Navajo that had already arranged lease agreements with Peabody Coal. And now both communities are seeing that their aquifer has lowered to the point that the naturally occurring arsenic now is existing in concentrations that are unsafe for human consumption. So, you know, this is, you know, you look at pipelines, look at where the sulfide mines in this country are located, look at where the uranium mines, where, you know, crazy amounts of logging happened at the turn of the century that ruined, you know, the soil. It's around Native communities because they've lacked political power, and it's, you know, there are areas that mainstream America has been willing to sacrifice.
And there are also areas that, excuse me, I apologize, spring allergies hitting hard this morning. Excuse me. So one of the conceptions in American law with respect to mineral rights is to get to your mineral rights, you can do what you need to on the surface land. And so a lot of these uranium mines that were dug out in Navajo territory destroyed the surface level of the land as well. And we also did not require, as Patty just referred to, cleanup of lands or formal closure of these mines afterwards. And so native peoples are living on these lands and suffering terrible radiation illnesses because of these open, exposed uranium mines on these lands. And very, very little of this has been cleaned up. The mines were just abandoned, and no one has been held to clean them up. I know that people in our chemistry department in Evanston have helped Navajo with some of the lands in Monument Valley, and that's been a wonderful thing that's happened. But that's a very small piece of these lands that have been contaminated, and as Patty said, not just contaminated, but the resources have been used in a way that has made continued survival on these lands not really possible.
And you look at things like the hydraulic fracturing, the fracking in Pawnee country and in present day Oklahoma, where earthquakes now, these minor earthquakes are happening with increasing intensity and frequency. In the Pacific Northwest, where people introduced fish farming of Atlantic salmon into the native Pacific salmon wild runs. This unconscionable use of natural resources by multinational corporations instead of the protection of these resources or relatives, depending on what your perspective is, for the public good is really horrifying.
And now another thing that we're seeing that's happening right now in this massive wave is because a lot of tribes have been trying to protect the land from oil pipelines. People probably know about the Dakota Access Pipeline fight. States are adopting laws that are preventing people from protesting.
Right.
And making it a crime to exercise any ability to get anywhere near what's happening to actually protest. And of course, Patty, I'll defer to your journalism aspect of this, but when you pull people away from protesting where it's happening, the media coverage of it isn't happening as much either. And so people are able to get away with more and more the farther you push people away from being able to bring attention to what's actually happening.
Line 5, if I can just put a plug in here, is the pipeline threatening my community of Bad River, and it crosses public lands, national forest lands, from Superior east across northern Wisconsin on the south shore of Lake Superior, then down southeast through Michigan, and then it splits into two smaller pipes and goes under the Straits of Mackinac. And there is some, and it starts in Canada and it ends in Canada. And communities like mine bear all the risk. It's traveling under our Wild Rice River, and the University of Michigan hydrologists have warned that if these pipes that go under the Straits of Mackinac, where Lake Michigan and Lake Huron come together, if the pipe ruptures there, it will travel in all the oil will travel in all directions at all levels and be a national or international disaster, because, you know, the Great Lakes contains most of the, you know, it's the source, the largest source of fresh water on the planet. And these pipes are 14 years past their expiration date. They were supposed to last 50 years. It's already year 16 past that, and they're off their moorings in some places in the Straits. They're because of climate change and erosion, the pipe is now exposed on some places in our reservation where oxbows are. The rivers have changed their meandering, and now the pipe is exposed. We sued Enbridge 2 years ago. The state of Michigan has sued Enbridge. But you look at, you know, ours is just one little example. This is happening on Indian lands across the country, whether it's the Dakota Access Pipeline or Line 3 in Minnesota or Line 5 in Wisconsin, fracking in Oklahoma, or uranium in the Four Corners region. I mean, we need to wake up.
If I could just add one thing, you mentioned Enbridge, and one of the things that's especially troubling, everything about what you were just describing is so troubling, but we also know that Enbridge is not a good actor. And they have had violations and leaks all over the place, done so much harm to nature already, and they're being allowed to do this in the most sensitive areas where you can't afford mistakes. And so there's a problem with, we are just not protecting people or resources in the way that we need to. And the law is not doing its job here. And I would say here, especially when you look at the Enbridge lines, this is someplace where money has won the fight. And that the very short term has also been winning, as opposed to a longer term, more holistic perspective on the earth.
Nancy and Patty, you both brought up some fantastic points, especially about the way in which we protect resources or don't protect resources specifically. And I'd like to engage the audience and show a short clip from the documentary to give them a bit more context as to what we're discussing here. So let me go ahead and do that.
This is the Poly Mine disaster in the headwaters of the Fraser River, one of the major salmon producing rivers of the planet. The same company that designed the dam that failed here has been engaged to do the tailings on the copper mine in Minnesota at the Boundary Waters.
The mining company went bankrupt, and they left the taxpayers on the hook to pay for the cleanup, right? It cost them $40 million, and the mining company paid nothing.
How we got all our public lands mixed up in all of this, I'm still working on that one.
In American history, we were very reckless with the environment. In the early 20th century, we were wreaking havoc on the continent. Deforestation, poisoned waters, unsanitary conditions. in the Dust Bowl, we had environmental disaster, nothing grew.
Beginning in about 1932, 33, people were not happy with the lack of regulation about these lands. And they really began to see the necessity of maintaining and protecting the public lands.
People said, we've got to save what remains of our wilderness. And through the years, every president or politician got measured on what's your record on conservation. I tend to shock people when I ask them, do you know who created the EPA and endangered species and clean air and water?
We can no longer afford to consider air and water common property, free to be abused by anyone without regard to the consequences.
The public in the 60s and 70s demanded that our public lands be protected. They used to say public lands is bipartisan. It's not doesn't belong to a party. It's about Americanism. But at the time, oil and gas and mining was still largely unregulated.
After World War II, they created the Bureau of Land Management. 1963 Wilderness Act.
Increase the beauty of America.
1970, the Clean Air Act.
Strict standards.
72, the Clean Water Act.
Deal with water pollution.
74, the Endangered Species Act. And in 1976, they created the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or as it's called in the federal government, FLPMA. And FLPMA was to allow the multiple use on public lands.
The Act directs the Bureau to administer the public lands for the benefit of all Americans.
So yes, you can have mining. Yes, you can have oil and gas exploration, cattle grazing, but under a certain federal standard. So now all of a sudden there are all these restrictions on cattle grazing on public lands. So farmers and ranchers were quite upset.
Ranchers are complaining that the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, doesn't identify with ranching problems.
What we think of as the Sagebrush Rebellion began in 1976. There were genuine cattlemen who had a lot of anger over management of public lands. As the Sagebrush Rebellion progressed, there was kind of an evolution of this anger into political theater.
The rebellion floundered until last summer when Ronald Reagan pledged his support during the campaign. I don't know about you, but I happen to be one who cheers on and supports the Sagebrush Rebellion.
Reagan, as one of his first acts, appointed a guy named James Watt.
You brought a certain constituency to your office as Secretary.
Oh, sure. I brought the American people in and I made people part of the environmental equation. We've got to put America first, create American jobs.
Watt believed that the Bible, if not God, had told him that the land was to be drilled and blasted in God's name.
James Watt thought all conservationists were pagan, that it became more of a religious divide as well as a political divide.
The Reagan administration used the Sagebrush Rebellion to turn people against the federal government.
An agency in Washington can tell you exactly what you can or can't do with your land in the name of environmentalism, which is the greatest threat in 200 years.
And people embraced it with incredible fervor.
It's the bureaucrats forcing regulations down on us. Not gonna.
So this language, this rhetoric is certainly not new. We've heard it before, certainly in the previous administration. And my question to both of you, Nancy and Patty, I'd love to hear from you first. With concepts like American individualism and manifest destiny, how do we challenge those uniquely American concepts and reframe protection of public lands and Native peoples as something that's nonpartisan, especially when the consequences ultimately affects everyone?
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to something I just put in the chat. The late Ojibwe activist Walt Brissett was a leader in the struggle to pass the Seventh Generation Amendment, which is just a different kind of environmental stewardship framework. And the Seventh Generation Amendment, well, first of all, Seventh Generation is a philosophy that exists among the people of my nation, but also other tribes like the Oneida and some of the other Haudenosaunee people. It's an environmental ethic that basically obligates people in the present generation to act in the best interests of generations in the future. And in acting in a generous way, it also makes us look back and appreciate and express gratitude for the ancestors who acted in a way to make our lives better in this generation. And so, Walt Brissett sort of, growing up with that ethos, led this movement to pass a Seventh Generation Amendment, which read, the rights of citizens of the United States to use and enjoy air, water, wildlife, and other renewable resources determined by Congress to be common property shall not be impaired, nor shall such use impair their availability for the use of future generations. And, I know that wasn't exactly, those weren't exactly the words that he would have chosen, because I don't think we think of our natural landscape as property. And in fact, it reminds me of an environmental think tank weekend that I was part of, where the Onondaga faith keeper, Oren Lyons, who is a really interesting, you should Google Oren Lyons. He has some interesting things to say about the Doctrine of Discovery. But anyway, we're all in this environmental conference, and there were a lot of state natural resource workers there. And he, at one point, challenged everybody to look out the window and said, so look out the window, what do you see? And there's this awkward silence. Everybody's trying to figure out what to say. And someone raised their hand and said, natural resources, trees, bushes, flowers. And Oren just kind of nodded and said, that's interesting. When I look out the window, I see relatives. And it was this, really interesting moment that I think is reflected in this movement to think about the way we relate to everything in our environment, and to feel that relationship and that reciprocity, and to act in a way that's noble and respectful of things in nature. And so I think about the tremendous change, challenges that we face now with climate change. Well, you know what? Indigenous people have been adapting to climate change since the last ice age. We know something about change. So why isn't anybody asking us? We have this traditional ecological knowledge. And I think it's really clear that the path we're on right now is not sustainable, and that we have to really do a serious reboot in the way we use our resources and relate to resources or relatives. I'll stop there.
I'm not really sure how to add to what Patty has said. I think there is an unfortunate and harsh reality that the film picked up on, going back to around 1980, where the United States is, going back to Teddy Roosevelt and before, we've always talked about individualism, but there's also been some greater sense of community. And that's something that I think that we've lost in a large part of our population in the name of individual freedoms. And it is resulting in these broader losses from things like climate change. We can't address a problem that is affecting everyone because every step we take is being seen by a huge part of our population as infringing on this individualism. And I think what we need, and Cassandra, I think your question identified this in a way, is a way to convince people that you don't necessarily lose something as an individual by participating in and protecting a broader community or the generations to come. I don't want to get political, but you can look at just the conversation right now about vaccinations. And when I'm in Chicago, I live in a high-rise building downtown where there was actually a huge discussion battle about whether people should have to wear masks in an elevator because some people didn't like to wear masks, although it was known that there were several people living in this building who had serious illnesses and would almost certainly have died if they had come down with COVID. And I just use that as an example of this bigger question. I don't think we can really address how we deal with how we're treating our lands and climate change until we find a way to talk to each other in a way that convinces each other that all of us have a stake in everything together.
So following up on that, Nancy, the way in which we currently treat our lands and those who, of course, have grown on these lands, lived off of these lands, how do we reconcile with the environmental damage that has been caused to these lands, the health outcomes that the natives endure? And also, is there a consideration for land as a structure that has rights, even personhood, if you will?
There's a wonderful book. Patty's smiling, I'm sure she knows it. It's an older book. It's called Should Trees Have Standing? Which is another, standing is a legal concept that says you have some right that lets you go into court to be protected. And in an ideal world, I think trees would have standing. I don't, as a very realistic practicing lawyer, I think the chances of us reaching that anytime soon, any conception of rights in nature or in animals beyond human beings in the way that we're talking now is unlikely. And I think we need to find a way to attach people to the importance of the land and animals and their preservation and how everything is interconnected without, in recognizing where the current headset for so many people is. I say that very sadly. But I also think if we want to achieve the kinds of protections we need, if we want to start addressing climate change, we have to convince people to become a part of something that isn't just them. And I think if you start talking about, I'm looking out at trees growing their leaves right now in the country, and it is so deep in my heart, but I don't believe it's going to be in everyone's in a way that if we talk about it that way and focus on it that way, that we're going to be able to accomplish what we really need to. I say that with the deepest sadness.
Well, there are rights of nature movements around the world. The government of New Zealand granted, and I'm doing that in air quotes because the Maori people would say that human beings don't have the right to grant rights to anything else. But the government of New Zealand extended personhood to the Wanganui River, which is a sacred river to the Maori. I know that Ecuador has passed a constitutional amendment called the Rights of Nature Amendment. The Anishinaabe Ojibwe in White Earth have extended or acknowledged personhood to wild rice. And I don't know that this is something that legally stood, but I know that the Toledo City Council passed a rights of nature ordinance for Lake Erie, maybe a year and a half ago. Whether these will stand up in a court of law. I remember when I first heard about this rights of nature movement and the actions of White Earth, I talked to the White Earth tribal attorney and said, so is this the other side of the coin from Citizens United, that corporations have personhood and they have a voice, that nature would have a voice as well? And he said, no, it's not the same, because corporations are an artificial human-made construct, and the relationship that the Ojibwe people have with nature is not artificial, which is an interesting way for him to describe that. But, I've been really excited about looking at some of these rights of nature movements around the world. And I don't have any background in law, so I can't really, all I can do is keep my fingers crossed, but I can't comment with any kind of authority about how rights of nature laws would likely fare here in the United States.
Well, so it's great to me just to hear you speak that way and add some touch of hope to the future, that people's minds can begin to understand the importance of nature for itself, not just for us. But the one thing I will say about the rights of nature movement is we inevitably, and again, I've got my lawyer headset on here, but we inevitably define those rights as a legal matter in terms of how they relate to us.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from the audience, and I will ask, from a global perspective, is America a leader in the environmentalism we are discussing? I would assume no, but I would love to hear from both of you on your responses to that.
I'm going to defer to Nancy, as more of a legal expert, but as a Native person, I would say probably not.
And I would say, as anyone speaking for the 4 years before January 20th, 2021, that we were as far from that as is at all possible. We were leaders in the destruction of nature, the environment, health, in more ways than I ever thought we could conceive of. I am hopeful that we will see a change. I think there's more than symbolism to having Deb Haaland be the person in charge of our public lands, and being a Native person and her relationship to the land being different from what has certainly been the message of recent years. The climate conference that was held at the end of last week, we certainly would not have seen. And I think it is so important that this is happening, and it gives me a measure of hope that I haven't had in the past. Are we a leader in the world? We haven't been. I think there's some opportunity to try to move forward. I will sort of say there are other things. I don't know that us being the leader is the most important thing, as our giving voice and acting on it. There's an election coming up in Germany where the Green Party could actually become the dominant party in government. At as Patty mentioned, New Zealand, and people around the world sort of looking at things differently. So I see hope in where we're going now. I hope that we continue to move forward, and I hope that we also can recognize our environmentalism beyond the way it looks to white eyes.
So in being able to change the way environmentalism looks to quote unquote white eyes, as you say, Nancy, how can the conservation and environmental movement better integrate BIPOC voices and identities into these discussions and solutions of protecting public lands?
So I think Patty can answer that better than I am from the white eyes perspective. I'd start right out saying, hey, let's recognize that we're not the only people there. There are other people who deserve to have voice. And a lot of, I became an environmental attorney because I'm a tree hugger. I am a tree hugger, and I'm a proud one, but most of my environmental work today is not about what we're talking about right now, because there's so much injustice in the environmental world, and how each of us gets to experience nature and the environment or not experience. That almost all of my time now is spent trying to help promote the voice and the rights of BIPOC communities, most often in more urban environments where they're being trampled so horribly. But I do believe environmental justice is much broader than that, and that we have to find a way to say to people, your voice matters every bit as much as mine. And then the other thing I'll just say as sort of the white attorney is I can give voice to the law and being an attorney, but I'm not the person who should speak for the Ojibwe or for the people on the south or southeast side of Chicago who are actually experiencing things. We have to give other people besides us the ability to speak. And I say that for all the traditionally white environmental groups.
Yeah, I would echo what Nancy mentioned, and also say we need better education at an earlier age. I think, our textbooks that have become so standardized that, present this this rosy view of manifest destiny and colonialism and progress, and wrapped up in our rituals and our celebrations, our holidays, the people whose lives we celebrate. I think we need to begin with some honest acknowledgement of stolen land and stolen labor, and then go from there, and teach our children a more authentic view, a more authentic history of this country, and focus on civic. We don't teach civics anymore, and when we did, we conveniently forgot whole communities of brown and black and yellow people. And I think we need to be more inclusive, and I'm really encouraged by some of the diversity initiatives. Land acknowledgements, as long as they're not performative, I think that's been a really important movement going forward. I think the BIPOC coalitions that are forming is really positive. It's going to make some people uncomfortable, but I think we need to strip away some of the jingoism and the imperialism, and and start from a point. And one of the things I think about is, my people have a prophecy, and it talks about the lighting of the seventh fire, that we're in this time of great change, and we have this crossroads that we come to. And one path is a hard, stony path that leads to ruin, and the other is a soft green path of sustainability, and that new people will emerge. The Ojibwe can't do it alone. We have, these new people that we have to partner with, that we need in order to together light this final fire that leads to peace and prosperity. So, I find great comfort in that. And I see these environmental groups, the young people emerging that are understandably concerned about climate change, that are thinking more about social justice and environmental justice. And that gives me great hope.
If I could just say one more thing, I think we're pretty close to out of time. There's a very American thing, but people thing, where we tend to see things as a zero-sum game. If something improves for me, it's a loss for you. And there's actually a lot of that in how we think about environmental issues as well. And I actually think that's wrong. I think every time we protect something and protect people, we actually expand the universe of what we all share. And if there were a way to get us away from the I win, you lose, as opposed to we all win in this together perspective, that it would help a lot.
Thank you, Nancy, for those final thoughts. And I want to, of course, thank everyone who was in attendance today, this afternoon. I will transition this to Araceli and Ivy to close us out. If there are any final thoughts, please share them.
Well, thank you so much to everyone that participated today and asked questions. I know we all have a lot of reading to do after this. Like, I already have some books added to my Amazon list, but we'll send more information after today's event. But thank you both, Nancy and Patty, for joining us, and thank you, Cassandra and Ivy, for hosting us today. Have a great rest of your day, and sign up for our newsletter if you want to join more programming like this.
Thank you.
Bye.
Amazing. Thank you.